I can't remember. I must have been 10 or something like that. I remember, yeah, my mom's going on a trip by herself to the desert for 10 days. And I know you guys can't see my mom, but she's all of like 5 feet and this little gorgeous Southern belle. But you're just fierce on the inside, Mom. Welcome to Baby or Bust. I'm your host, Dr. Lora Shahine, and I am tired of infertility and miscarriage being misunderstood, hidden, and full of stigma. Welcome to the podcast with interviews and in-depth discussions and topics on all things fertility. Thank you to our friends at Seattle Sperm Bank and Braze Run Production for sponsoring the show. Please take a moment to give us a 5-star review anywhere you listen to your podcast. It really helps the show. This is a truly special episode for me, and I hope it's special for you who is listening. I am interviewing a woman I admire, a woman who inspires me, and someone I can't wait for you to learn from, like I do every day. Charlene Ewing, my mother. I was inspired to ask my mom to come on the show from listening to a wonderful podcast called Wiser Than Me by Julia Louis-Dreyfus. You likely know this actress from her iconic role as Elaine on Seinfeld or as Vice President Selena Meyer on HBO's shows Veep. Each episode of her podcast, Julia, who's in her 60s, interviews an incredible woman wiser than her. She argues that women who have lived long lives have so much to share, but we just don't ask. We don't listen, but we should because we can learn so much from them. She's had Jane Fonda, Carol Burnett, Diane von Furstenberg, and many more, and I love learning from these conversations. After each interview, Julia calls her mom to reflect on what she's learned during that interview. I highly recommend listening to the podcast. When brainstorming with my producer for guests for Baby or Bust, I thought of my mom, a woman I admire who is definitely wiser than me, and I am thrilled to have her here on the show today. Mom, welcome to Baby or Bust.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
And it's not just that you have lived a life longer than me, because I'm in my 40s. You're almost 80?
79.
I love it.
Almost 80. Yes, you're right.
But you have lived such a full life. Someone growing up in a pretty small town in North Carolina, started college in the 1960s, eloped with a sailor when you were 19, had my sister, your first daughter, in Italy. Oh my goodness. And then coming back to LA, putting yourself through college at that time, 2 master's degrees later, a divorce when none of your friends were getting divorced, married my dad. I mean, I can go on and on. You've faced so much adversity and always stayed true to being curious, a love of education, and always having faith in yourself. You truly are a woman I admire.
Wow. You leave me speechless.
Well, I know that one of the last things in the world you wanted to do when you were visiting me on this vacation was to be interviewed. But you did it. You're here. You said, over my dead body. And then you came back and said, I'll do it. Why? Why are you here?
Because you're my daughter and you're incredible. And I'm so proud of you.
Oh, you did it. You said, okay, that's amazing. Thank you. But you told me you did it because you're here today because you were scared, because you've never done anything like this before. You've never been interviewed before.
Well, that's true. I was scared, but that shouldn't stop me because that's the way people learn, is to do what they're afraid of and go ahead and do it. And then they find out it wasn't so bad after all. And it might even be fun.
Well, I hope you do have fun today. And you've really modeled that attitude my whole life. And I think that that is one of the reasons that I am a doctor and one of the reasons that I'm doing all the education that I am doing, because I didn't actually have any role models in the family. We don't have any doctors in the family.
True.
Do you remember when I first, like a lot of times people ask me, oh, how did you know you wanted to be a doctor? And I love it when you tell this story.
Yeah, that was quite a surprise. You were actually going to Salem Academy. They have Jan terms, and you had gone overseas. And when you came back, all the parents went down to the airport to welcome their girls home. You came running off the plane, came running up to your dad and me, and said, "Guess what? When I was on the plane, the stewardess came on and said, 'Is there a doctor on board?'" And you said, when she said that, I knew immediately that someday I was going to answer that call. I was going to be that doctor. And your dad and I looked at each other and raised our eyebrows, and they thought, well, we'll see. Because, yes, you were a good student, but you were quite interested in playing with your friends and playing sports. And
people often think that I've always been driven and goal-oriented and straight A student, but that wasn't really the case. I think it's hilarious that when you guys looked at each other and were like, yeah, right, she is going to be a doctor.
Well, that's what happened.
And then you were telling me like a year later, the same January term. So this is like I think it's a 3-week stint in our high school where people could do something outside of the classroom. You could travel, you could do an internship, you could do something on campus, just kind of get out of your comfort zone. And I had set up a year after that airplane ride an internship with a pediatric surgeon at Wake Forest Medical Center. And you often will tell other people about how I used to come home so excited from that internship.
Oh, absolutely. He would pick you up at the crack of dawn. It was dark outside. You'd go off. You'd come back when it was dark at night, and you would just be glowing, and you couldn't stop talking about all the exciting things that had happened at the hospital. I know there was one time you came home and you were telling me that you had been on your feet all morning, and it was getting, I don't know, 1 or 2 o'clock, and you hadn't had anything to eat. And Dr. Turner suggested that you go off and take a break and get something to eat. And so you went out and you had some pizza, and you came back and you watched the next operation. And I said to myself, Lora is going to be a surgeon someday. If she can do that.
Yep. Watch operations, go eat pizza, and come back.
Come right back and do the same thing and never miss a beat. Yeah. I was really impressed.
Yeah. It is. I mean, but I like that you're able to share that. And I don't remember what I was like in grammar school or middle school or high school. And I think it's pretty inspirational to know that someone doesn't have to be completely driven from day one to figure out what path they're going to go on. And another thing that I think is really interesting is I didn't realize until actually I was graduating from medical school that although we don't have any doctors in the family, that the family member that I'm named after, Lora Gahan, my great-grandmother, you told me when I was graduating from medical school what she wanted to do.
Right. She wanted to be a physician. But back in 1900, ladies were not physicians. And it was really pretty remarkable that her dad let her go to college, which he did. But he would not let her go to medical school because women just, particularly ladies, as they say, did not go to medical school at that time.
But then she went on to teach physical education.
Right.
And I never knew her, But it's pretty wild that I was so sports oriented and even played field hockey in college and eventually became a doctor. And I never knew that until I graduated from medical school.
She probably inspired you.
It's pretty amazing.
She was down here saying, "Go, Lora."
Oh. So one of the questions that I always ask my patients, especially when I'm getting to know them, is any fertility history in your family, difficulty conceiving, fertility diagnoses. And honestly, when I look back at my family, I can just hear you always talking about how easy it was for you to get pregnant.
Well, I assumed it was easy for everybody to get pregnant. And at my time, that just was something that wasn't talked about. Girls were careful to be good girls until they got married. And after they got married, they got pregnant and had babies. And that was it. Yeah. And that's what happened to me.
But like so many of my patients, I carried that narrative, like, oh, in my family, it's really easy to conceive. So that when I was facing my own difficulties with infertility, it was just an absolute shock. And I see this happening to my patients too. You know, how could I be struggling with infertility when my mom and everybody in my family gets pregnant so easily? And I just, so I can really empathize with my patients that sort of have that feeling. But I also remember hearing, but never really asking questions. I remember you talking about how when you delivered me, you had high blood pressure. Later on, I figured out that was preeclampsia. And I remember you talking about having a hysterectomy when you were really young. But I never really asked you. And I just found out a year ago that you had endometriosis. We never talked about this. And here I am talking to my patients about how important it is to share with family members and friends. And it's pretty interesting that I never really learned about your history, even though I was struggling with my own.
I'm not sure why that is, except that people just didn't talk about things like that in those days. And I know my mother was very sympathetic with me because she had the same problems. Horrible periods. I started when I was 11, and every month I would get terrible cramps. I'd throw up. I'd miss a day or two of school. And for me, that was just normal.
Do you remember talking to doctors about the symptoms that you were having?
I remember going to doctors, but it was always my mother who talked to the doctors. And I remember learning later, one summer when I was at camp, I took pills, and I found out later those were
birth control pills.
Birth control pills, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. At the age of 14 or 15 to be taking birth control pills. And then it was just for that summer. I don't know why they stopped. And I had horrible cramps until my first pregnancy. And my first pregnancy was a blessing because after that, I didn't have such horrible cramps anymore.
Oh, I remember doctors, advising women, in the 60s, 70s, oh, if you have painful periods, just get pregnant. It's like that easy. But it is true that sometimes people like you after the pregnancy have less painful periods. And I'm not exactly sure why that is.
I'm not either, but it was a blessing.
Yeah. And I never suffered from the painful periods that you and my sister and my grandmother had. I just remember you talking about getting a hysterectomy when you were in your young 40s.
Yeah, I was in my mid-40s, and at that time I'd had 2 pregnancies, so I wasn't having the terrible cramps anymore, but I was still bleeding very, very heavily every time I had a period, and that was why I had the hysterectomy, so I wouldn't bleed so much. It was debilitating.
Thank you for sharing that.
Well, you're welcome.
There's too many people out there that are really suffering with painful periods every month or really heavy bleeding. And that's one of the reasons I'm trying to educate so much, here on the podcast and my blog and Instagram and things, is to try to help people realize what's normal in air quotes or typical or average and how to advocate for their care. Because, in your generation, people just didn't talk about it. And I think that left a lot of people suffering. And I think in my generation and subsequent generations, people are hopefully going to suffer less because they're learning to speak out and learning to say, if one doctor says, oh, it's normal to have pain with periods, just deal with it, that they will go to a different doctor and ask for more questions. The average time from onset of painful periods and true diagnosis of endometriosis still today is 7 to 8 years.
Oh my goodness.
Because people just are told, yep, cramps are supposed to be painful. And what they don't realize is sometimes people have a little bit of light cramps, but it doesn't mean you're supposed to throw up and be on the bathroom floor and skip school and work and things like that because of a period every month. I'm so sorry that you had to deal with that.
Well, thank you.
Another thing that I remember you kind of talking about growing up and sort of becoming my narrative as I was struggling to build my own family was just how hard it was for you to be 4 years apart in age from your sister. It's just little offhanded comments, or just how it would have been so much nicer to be closer in age. And that sort of fits along with the society's narrative of kids should be 2 years apart. And so, I struggled to have my first, Sarah, but had her relatively soon. But trying to have my second, secondary infertility, it kept going on. And I had this mental calculator of when the due date was going to be. And I was so terrified that they were going to be, it's okay. They were going to be 4 years apart. And
so sorry.
That's okay. I want to share it though, because I think it's a really good example of, we really do internalize, the things that our family and our parents say. And so they are 3.5 years apart by just come hell or high water and IVF and multiple transfers. But I hear the nervousness in my own patients when they're struggling with secondary infertility. So that means you've had a baby and you're trying to add to your family, and they're just so nervous about making it happen as soon as possible because they kind of feel that. So it helps me empathize with my patients. It's not all bad, Mom.
I'm
it's really
glad to hear that.
And then I actually just on Friday, I was talking to a patient about that. She's now in her IVF cycle, and her kids are going to be 4.5 years apart as long as she gets pregnant soon with her transfer. And she and I talked about it actually at her very first visit. And I often share very personally, I was nervous about that too. And how it was actually such a benefit because Sarah loved grabbing diapers for the baby and, helping, and kind of having 2 kids in diapers, I think would be really hard. And there's beauty in all types of spacing, but just seeing that patient kind of come around and sort of surrendering to the fact it is actually going to be nice, if the first one's out of the house, for college, then I've still got this little one at home for a few more years. And so just being able to really talk to people about that. And it's been very helpful.
A lot of it, I think, is the attitude of the parent too, because my mother used me as a babysitter, and that was difficult for me, having this little toddler running after me when I was trying to keep up with my friends. And I think if my mother had handled it differently, I would have felt much happier about having a baby sister.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. So one of the things that I've always admired about you, Mom, is you were able to really show me how you could be both a good mother and wife and have a wonderful, home life, but also have a job and a career outside of the home. And that wasn't the case with a lot of my other friends' parents and home life. And I'm just curious, growing up as you did in the 60s and 70s, what was the drive for you to continue to teach outside the home and have your career outside the home?
Well, I think growing up, watching my parents, my mother was the wife of an executive. She entertained a lot in the home, and I just always knew that that was not going to be enough for me, even though she frowned on the idea of women working. I just felt I wanted to teach, and I'm not sure where that urge came from, but I did want to teach, and that was my goal, and that's what I worked toward, and I'm so glad I did.
I know. You've had multiple careers. You got a master's in library science, and you were the lead librarian at the Winston-Salem Public Library. And then I knew you as teaching English in the high school that I went to, and you went to too, Salem Academy, the wonderful girls' school in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I love talking about this. The first school dedicated to the education of women in the United States, founded in 1772. That's amazing.
And
you went there.
I think that had a lot to do with the reason that I wanted to go into teaching, because I had such a wonderful time there as a student. I admired my teachers immensely, and they were my role models. They really were.
Well, it's pretty amazing I never had you as a teacher because I always would be put with the other teacher in the grade, but just my friends loved having you as a teacher. They always talked about Mrs. Kelly. And there was always a sense of pride with that because you were so admired by other teachers and by the students. I never really shared that with you, but I can definitely see how some kids would just feel awkward having their parents teach in the school or something like that. But I was always really, really proud to be your daughter.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah. I really do.
Yeah. And, I never felt that any less than because you were working outside of the home. I always felt that you were both a wonderful mom and homemaker, but also had this life that was outside of the home, outside of your husband, and really important to you. You've always just modeled such independence. I'll never forget when you finished your master's in English at Wake Forest that Dad helped support you in taking your own trip to Mesa Verde. I can't remember. I must have been 10 or something like that. I remember, my mom's going on a trip by herself to the desert for 10 days. And I know you guys can't see my mom, but she's all of like 5 feet and this little gorgeous Southern belle. But you're just fierce on the inside, Mom. You've faced so much adversity.
That was a trip I really, really wanted to take. And I am just so glad I had the opportunity, because those days of traveling around and looking at all the ruins, not just Mesa Verde, but all of the ruins in that area and meeting so many interesting people. It was just very, very special.
Well, and I appreciated being in a home where the husband supported his wife leaving
I did too.
Do something independent for herself. Like that modeled for me, wanting to have my own career and my own life and just being very confident that I could do both. But for you, you didn't have that modeling. You came from a very different home environment, very traditional male, female roles, but yet still put yourself out there. And so that's one of the reasons I am so inspired by you.
Well, I think it was part of the 60s too. I was on the cusp of women's liberation, and it was interesting to see that so many of the women who followed me thought the way I did. I'm not sure why that started, but
because of women like you, Mom.
It was interesting times.
Well, I think you lead with curiosity. A part of that is being okay trying new things, whether it is eloping when you're 19 years old with a sailor and moving to Italy, whether it is putting yourself through college at UCLA or getting your master's degree, whether it's, going on this incredible trip by yourself to Mesa Verde, or whether it's coming onto the podcast today. You've always been able to build the courage to try new things and allow yourself the space to both fall, but stumble and pick yourself up, and you're better for it. And that's just a beautiful thing to model.
And look at this beautiful daughter that I have that I'm so proud of.
Oh, Mom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the show today and doing something that you absolutely did not want to do whatsoever. How do you feel now?
I feel pretty excited. I did something new at my age. I love it.
Oh, well, I love you, Mom.
I love you too.
I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did with my mom. This is absolutely an experience I will never forget. And I loved sharing with you some of the life lessons that she has shared with me. You can find this episode and all others on my website, drlorashahine.com. I love educating. You can find me on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Please share your own fertility story and topics. Send us an email, hello@drlorashahine.com. Thank you to my producer, Shannon Perry, and her team at Audiotocracy. This is your host, Dr. Lora Shahine. See you next week. And until then, wishing you love, luck, and pineapples.